Well, from that point on, you would think it would get easy, but it got weirder. Over the next few years, I was incorporated in the church. As I was constantly witnessing and sharing with my friends. Hundreds of people came to Christ. We filled this little church up, and there was harmony at one level. I mean, the people were lovely people. I want you to know that. But they just didn't know how to relate to these newcomers. They were not homogenous with them. They didn't relate well to them. The newcomers had a different lifestyle. They had a different value system. You know, I thought we were supposed to catch them and that we'd all clean them together. I didn't know that they wanted them cleaned before I brought them home to church. But over a period of time, that became evident. And there was tension over that all the time. And I remember one day, a lovely lady, one that I had a lot of respect for, but had grown up in that church. One day she stood at the back door of the church, tears running down her face, her chin trembling, and she was just violently angry with me. And she said, "You've ruined my church." And I looked at her and I thought, that's the truth. We've really messed your church up. And I stood there and I started crying with her, and I put my arms around her and I said, "I really love you." And I said, I feel your pain. I understand your confusion. But I said, what could I do? You people took me in. You embraced me. And could I leave the rest of them out there, dying and going to hell? I had to tell them about Jesus. I had to tell them what you'd given me. And she said, I know. It's just that change is so hard. It's so hard. And we wept together that day. And I've never forgotten that. I've never forgotten her pain. Because she was a lovely lady that loves the Lord. But all of these strangers, all of this change, all of these new people coming in had frustrated her and served to ruin the church that she loved. It had become a new church, a different church. Over the next few years, it grew larger and larger until it became one of the larger churches in the denomination. We relocated and built a big facility, and we were very proud of it, inordinately. I think sometimes I was even carnally connected at that point. I was very proud of that church. Not only the facility, but the people. One day I'm walking along in the church. This is several years later. I'm now a pastor, been ordained for about 3 or 4 years, had some visibility in the denomination and outside of it, had helped plant other churches, and was recognized in the community and in a very nice position in life. And I'm walking along, and I had just had this exchange with a young man in the church who I had to set straight. Because he hadn't been coming to church regularly, and he came to me and he was confessing a problem that he was having, and I said, you wouldn't have this problem if you were just in the church more often. You need to be at church more often, and you need to learn to give, and you need to learn to be more involved, and there's some work and some service here that if you just get connected with that, and I preached him the party line. I laid it out for him. I said, you need to be here, man, if you're going to get this stuff straightened out. Now, I did it with a good heart and a good intent, but I preached in the party line, and as I was walking away from him, the Lord spoke to me, and He said, John, would you go to this church if you weren't paid to? Now, you've got to understand the context of this. This is years later, and this is my church. I'm the pastor. Along with another, we were co-pastors. But it was my church, and my thumbprints were all over that place. I helped design the building and select the colors and led most of the people to Christ that were there. Hundreds of them. It was my church. And God spoke to my heart and said, if you weren't paid, would you go here? And I'm walking along, and I started walking slower and slower, and I thought, no way. I don't like this place. And it was a moment of revelation for me. And I suddenly realized that I was doing something I didn't even like. And I went, it was so staggering to me, I hurried off into my little office there, and I sat down and I thought, and in front of my desk, and I thought, what's wrong? What's wrong? Now, I want to tell you something. There's 2 or 3 prayers that God always answers. And one of the ones that He always answers is, God, what's wrong with me? If you don't want to know the answer to that, never ask it. But I asked it. I said, God, what's wrong with me? And boy, did He unload. He began showing me how I'd gotten caught up in administration and machinery, and how I'd become so mechanical and manipulative. how I'd come to a place where I loved the institution more than the body of Christ. How I'd gotten to a place where I was angered and frustrated by those that wouldn't fall in line and take their rightful places and honor their and respect their duties and all. And at the same time, I had earlier on defended those same people as when I was so active in converting them. And I'd come to a place where I was so institutionalized myself and so tied into its values, to its focus, that I was the worst of all the offenders. And I sat there and I began sobbing and sobbing and sobbing. And I said, "Oh God, what's wrong? How did it get this way?" And He began showing me just piece after piece, point after point, showing me how I had turned away and turned away. Again and again, the Spirit of God had spoken to me. And I had turned from the Spirit and went after the things that I thought were logical and right and orderly, and those things that would prosper, and those things that could easily be adapted into the institution, into the organization. And I had given myself over to the things not of God, but the things that were like God and for God. And I had in the process made the institution and my ministry God, and He was no longer God at all in my life. As I recognized that day, God began showing me out of the New Testament various scriptures and showed me the relationship and the difference between the church as I knew it, the church that I had made, and the church that He made. It wasn't until years later that God spoke to me profoundly on this subject, but I understood even that day that I had begotten something that was not of God. And I cried out in my agony and I said, "Oh God, get me out of here." 3 weeks later, I was gone. Nearly 13 years I'd been there. 3 weeks later, I was gone. God opened the door for me to begin working at Fuller Seminary. In the founding organization under Charles E. Fuller, during his lifetime, he established an organization called Fuller Evangelistic Association that has since been altered to Charles E. Fuller Institute for Evangelism and Church Growth. But during this time in 1974, I began working for the Fuller Evangelistic Association and developing a new department called the Department of Church Growth. Now, I had become somewhat expert in the general field of church growth without having, at that time, been exposed to the larger body of literature. But just through instinct and basic knowledge and know-how, I had figured out the mechanics of helping churches grow. It could have worked on the Kiwanis Club as well as the local church, but these were just basic social understandings that I had developed that helped organizationally to achieve the ends of that organization. It was redeemed at the point that I would have only done it for what I thought was Christ's work, but it was incomplete at the point that I had become adept at doing something that I could be paid for. It was rather mechanical. Over the next few weeks and months, I became acquainted with the literature of church growth and became very committed to the basic teaching as well as philosophy. And in that process of doing so, I began developing the consultative ministry of Fuller Evangelistic Association Department of Church Growth. During the next 3.5 years, we worked with churches all over America and Canada, primarily the United States. We ministered to about 40,000 pastors during that period of time in seminars such as the one you're in today. Over that period of time, we worked with 27 denominations and 9 parachurch organizations. And I became thoroughly acquainted with airports and motels and the church in America. And I found out that the church in America was not all that exciting, not all that stimulating. A lot of wonderful people, sincere people, godly people, but not doing much in the way of Bible kinds of activities. And after about 3.5 years of traveling across the country and helping churches grow that didn't want to grow, and that's the truth, working with people in ways and means that God would give me. You see, one of the tragic things was I was operating in spiritual gifts all the time. But I didn't know I was operating in spiritual gifts. I would go into a fellowship or into a community and I'd think, this is the way you're supposed to start the church here. I'd know exactly. I'd know weeks in advance how to begin the process, who to go see, what to do. I could tell them where they ought to locate their facility, and not by some natural means, but by supernatural means. And what I was doing was selling the gifts of the Spirit in a very, illegal way. It's not that it was wrong to do what I was doing, it was the way I was doing it and with the motivations that I had. And God began correcting me in the process. And over the next few weeks and months, beginning in 1974 and continuing through the latter part of 77, God began dealing with me fiercely. And I got to a point where I was almost spiritually bankrupt. I was humiliated and broken inside, worn out. I could do my job and I did it well, but I was bankrupt inside. And one night on an airplane flying towards Detroit, I found myself in a desolate place. And I began crying out to God. And I said, "Oh God, what's wrong? What's wrong with me? Here I am trying to serve you, but it just doesn't taste good. I'm tired, I'm worn out, the doctors say I'm going to die. I've eaten myself into the grave, my blood pressure is so high, my head throbs constantly, I'm worn out from standing long hours and lecturing, I'm tired of talking to people. Here I am going to Detroit, I don't even know anyone in Detroit. My wife and family are at home. What happened, God? How did it get all twisted around from God, I'll serve you, to this? How did I get here?" And I began weeping before the Lord and asking Him for direction. When I arrived in Detroit, I had missed an earlier plane, and so the people that were supposed to pick me up had already gone home, thinking I was coming at a later time, which I did. I needed a hotel room. God provided one in a matter of minutes. I've never had that happen before in any large city. But within 20 minutes, I was in a hotel room. And I was so grateful that for the first time in nearly 4 years, I opened the Bible to read it for myself. I'm not saying that I wasn't in the Bible every day. I read it constantly, but not for me. Just for information, for teaching, for things to give to others. And I sat down and just opened it casually, and it opened to Psalm 61. And as I read Psalm 61, I saw everything I had just prayed about written out. And I realized how desperate my soul condition was, and I knelt down on the floor by the bed and I said, "Oh God, here I am again. What's wrong with me?" And I fell asleep in that position before He could answer me. After a while, I grew uncomfortable, woke up, crawled into the bed, fell back asleep. And I don't know to this day whether I heard an audible voice or not, so you do what you want to with it. All I know is it woke me up. A couple of hours later, I heard God speak to me. I woke up and I realized He had said, "John, I have seen your ministry." And it was sort of like this. You could read it in the timbre of His voice. And then He spoke very lovingly and very compassionately. And He said, "And now I'm going to show you mine." And I just let out a yell. I said, "Oh Lord, that's what I've always wanted." And I just wept and wept throughout the night. The next morning I got up and I don't know what had happened, but things were different. I knew they were different. Similar to the time when I was converted. I just knew they were different. I knew that I was beginning an adventure. Over the next few weeks and months, God began doing things in my life that I'd never seen before.